He kissed me in the middle of the project site while a crane groaned and the city held its breath. It was the kind of kiss that broke rules and calendars and every careful thing I'd ever told myself. And when I pulled away, the safety helmet was still on my head, and his hand smelled of soil and something like daring. And I realized I'd been the one to draw the line, and he'd crossed it before I could stop him. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. The site office smelled of coffee and graphite and the faint dust of demolition. Bradley Mercer sat at the metal folding table like a man out of place in a field of disruptions. Pressed shirt, cufflinks that matched the exacting angle of his jaw, a leather case with blueprints rolled and strapped as if they were lives to be kept in order. He had spent the morning cross-referencing the contractor schedule with municipal permits, then spent the afternoon moving a bench 2 inches because 2 inches mattered. People called him precise. Other people called him unyielding. Marisol called him Mercer with a softness that sounded like apology and defense at once. Patton Hale angled his chin back against a stack of paver samples and laughed in a way that made the engineers glance up from their laptops. He had a bandana around his wrist, hands perpetually stained green, and a smile that rearranged room temperatures. Where Bradley's life had been built on tolerances, clearances, margins, the space between a plan and its execution, Patton lived in the generous overhangs, the places where vines could overtake columns and color could be allowed to spill beyond a curb. He carried seed catalogs like contraband and spoke of pollinators like they were old friends. When he spoke directly to plants, it was not theatrical, it was reverence. His designs were audacious in an uncalculated way that made Bradley's stomach do something he could not name. Marisol watched both men with an attention sharpened by loyalty and dread. She had been Bradley's assistant for 6 years, guardian of his calendar, translator of his silences. She navigated his world of obligations like one steers a small boat through a narrow channel, carefully, preemptively, with hands that remembered every bump of the hull. She also carried a secret she had folded into her coat pocket, an offer from a rival firm that promised enough money to move her mother out of the apartment that smelled of headaches and old tile. She had not mentioned it to Bradley because saying it felt like betrayal. She had not told him because he moved through her life the way architecture moved through a city. Slow, inevitable, essential. They met properly because the Redevelopment Commission had decided that what the riverfront needed was not just new concrete and lighting, but a language of welcome. Bradley had been given the master plan, the kind of assignment that stitched his name into the city's future. He wanted order. The board wanted risk, packaged in a way that would not scare the donors. Patton was hired to make the edges forgiving, to take Bradley's grids and add rust and rosemary and a human scale that could swallow people's loneliness. The board thought they were making a pragmatic choice. Bradley called in a collaboration he could manage, and that would, hopefully, stay on budget. On the second week, Patton arrived late for the morning walkthrough with dirt under his nails and an apology that bent toward charm. He told Bradley, in the way of people who do not think in steps but in whole landscapes, that the plaza needed a tree that leaned a little. Bradley said no, a long, professional no, that sounded like a clause pulled from a contract. Patton smiled as if Bradley had told a joke, and touched the railing with a lightness that mocked the plan. Marisol folded her arms and watched the two men orbit one another like planets whose pull was inconsistent but impossible to ignore. They both noticed the first thing they could not unsee the afternoon Patton decided to plant a test bed of wildflowers behind the temporary fencing. Bradley had not approved the soil amendment. He had not authorized the plant pellet. Patton did it anyway, in the space between late delivery and the contractor's shift change, an insurgent patch of color that trembled in the wind like a small defiant flag. Bradley came by to admonish. He found Patton on his knees, thumb wiping a smudge of mud off a pedal, eyes soft with concentration. Bradley's rebuke died in his throat because the sight was an arresting thing, control undone in a way that made control itself look petty. "You're not supposed to be doing that," Bradley said, the words clipped into ordinance. Patton looked up and shrugged in a way that asked for forgiveness and offered charm. Sometimes the site tells you what it needs. You can make a plan, Mercer, but the earth will have other ideas. There was a slide in his voice, an easy breach Bradley was not used to. Bradley found himself saying, more sharply than he intended, "You need approvals." "I'll email them," Patton said. "But while I'm here, do you mind if I see how it reads from the bench?" He reached toward the bench Bradley had insisted on aligning to the millimeter and sat without asking. The bench creaked, and Patton surprised Bradley by making a face of exquisite delight. The danger in that face was that it was not the look of someone flipping through a design brief. It was the look of someone seeing possibility and choosing it over procedure. Bradley's rule, his line, was neat. No fraternization between leadership and creative staff. He had written it into the project manual after watching a mentor's career dissolve when a romantic entanglement became a scandal. The rule had saved him by the time the city's papers had printed a different kind of headline about the man who drew the lines he could not keep. The line was practical, and it kept people from misreading gestures. The line was not, he told himself, about preserving his privacy. That was the truth he could not afford yet to say. Patton crossed physical lines like he crossed conversations, lightly, irreverently. He asked Bradley about his childhood in the suburbs in a tone that suggested Bradley might answer. Bradley deflected with diagrams. He turned the conversation into a discussion about plant hardiness zones, which should have been banal, but when Patton listened with that attentive face, Bradley felt, absurdly, like he had offered something personal and been refused the reciprocity. Marisol watched and worried. She had seen this before. Bizarre chemistry at work sites, people thinking rules were walls to be climbed. She liked Patton. He made plants laugh and made Bradley's jaw soften in ways that worried her more than anything the contractor's budget might do. Her fear was not melodrama. It was knowledge of consequence. If those two collided, the project could splinter. Donors could back away, and the firm might lose the commission that had been their proof that thoughtful design could heal a city. She knew Bradley's line was a fragile kind of armor. She knew what lay beneath it. Years of building a reputation in a field that punished softness. She had been the one to see his eyes after his father died, to inventory the small, private grief that Bradley carried like a sealed envelope. Late that night, after the site lights hummed down and the city had gone softer, the three of them found themselves in the temporary office again, arguing about the bench placement, the public sight lines, the irrigation schedule. The argument was professional and edged with something else, the tension of two people circling a border that had been drawn with intention. Patton pressed for a water feature that Bradley had rejected as unscalable. Bradley answered with numbers and precedent. Marisol attempted to mediate like a diplomat, offering compromises with the calm of someone who had practiced being reasonable for survival. When Marisol left to fetch more coffee, the room condensed. Bradley found himself caught in the net of Patton's gaze. The landscape architect, who had been talking about the movement of people through space, suddenly asked Bradley, "Why did you make the rule?" Bradley felt his throat tighten. Rules, in his world, were not confessions. They were instruments. "Because I have to keep the project safe," he said. It came out thin. Patton flopped his hand over his eyes and laughed, the sound like a plant unfolding. "Bullshit," he said. "You drew that line so you wouldn't have to choose.
You made a box and told everyone to live in it so you could stay comfortable." Bradley wanted to be angry, to deliver a correction that would restore the distance he relied on. Instead, he found himself answering in a voice that was lower than his usual. "I drew it because I learned the hard way, because I couldn't afford softness." Patton's fingers left his face. "Softness is not the same as weakness," he said. "Sometimes it's the only place to start making a mess you can be proud of." There was a moment, too long, too charged, where Bradley considered telling Patton the truth. He could tell him about the diagnosis tucked away in a folder at his doctor's office, the one he had not told his firm because vulnerability in their world was a liability. He could tell him about the mentor whose scandal had taught him to tighten his hand. He could tell him about how he drew lines because he feared that affection, public, messy, would cost him everything he had built. He could hand over the envelope of the life he had ironed into order and trust that the person on the bench would not use it as evidence against him. Instead, he said, "This project needs to survive." Patton's smile was tender and full of challenge. So does the person who lives inside it. That sentence was a thing that landed between them like a pebble dropped in a pond, making concentric circles they could not predict. Bradley's skin felt thin. The rule hung between them, taut and absurd, and suddenly personal. Marisol returned with coffee and found two men looking like strangers who had just mapped an old town they had never seen. At the end of the week, the dilemma that would pivot everything crystallized in an email flagged with urgency. A donor wanted assurances, written, about the project's professionalism after a rumor over champagne talk suggested the lead planner was making personnel decisions based on personal attachments. Nobody had said names. Everybody knew whose handwriting would appear on a protective clause that could defang any impropriety. Bradley could write the statement to reassure the donors and potentially suffocate the nascent life between him and Patton. Or he could refuse, risking the project and the livelihoods pinned to it. He had drawn lines in ink for years. Now he had to decide whether to draw one in principle at the expense of the person sitting on his bench. Bradley stared at the message and felt the architecture of his life shift. The line he had made to keep himself safe had become a wall that could also trap people he cared about. He knew with a certainty that made his hands tremble that whichever choice he made would not only alter the course of the redevelopment, but would define the contours of his life in ways he had meticulously avoided. He had always been adept at calculating tolerances. This equation required measuring risk to the heart, and he had never been taught how to do that without a blueprint.
Bradley left the message unopened for an hour, then an afternoon, then until the light in the site office turned from hard to honey, and the city outside became a grid of slow, patient headlights. He told himself he was drafting mitigating language in his head, phrases that soothed donors and steadied contractors, but really his thoughts kept colliding with the image of Patton on the bench, the soil under his nails, the way the landscape architect's laugh had folded into something like mercy. Every sentence he considered felt like erosion. Marisol found him there, untethered from his practice, and sat across from him with her own mug cupped in both hands. She watched him the way a person watches a map after a tremor, the lines intact, but the reliefs different. "You can do the letter," she said finally, voice even. "Add the clause about safeguards and third-party oversight. It will make them happy." Bradley made a noise that could have been assent or dismissal. "It will also install a wall in the name of compliance." "Isn't that what you do?" Marisol asked, not unkindly. "You set parameters so the builders and the financiers and the politicians all know how to act." "What if," Bradley said, "the parameters keep people out who matter? What if the clause is less about discipline and more about exile?" Marisol's jaw flexed. She looked away toward the window, where a stack of renderings lay like promises not yet fulfilled. She had her own ledger of compromises, the offer from the rival firm folded into the back pocket of her phone, unread emails from the headhunter. The possibility of leaving felt like trading one kind of loyalty for another. She wanted, she admitted, to stay in a place where she could still steer Bradley away from the cliffs she knew existed beneath his composure. "You have a way with the board," she said. "You can write something that protects the project and doesn't punish people for being human." Those last words were soft as a planting. "Human is exactly what the board fears," Bradley replied. "They fund certainty. They fund the clean lines." "It doesn't mean you have to live inside their box," Marisol said. He thought of Patton's hands in dirt, the reckless art of making places hospitable, and realized with a quiet panic that he had spent his life corralling hazard, emotion among them, into permitted zones. He had believed he was protecting himself. Now the protection felt like a prison that might also trap those with the capacity to light his rooms. When Bradley walked back out to the site, he kept his head down as if he could avoid glances. He had not rehearsed how to look at Patton without offering some defensive armor. But Patton was waiting near the test bed with a trowel tucked behind his ear like a pen, as if they were about to take notes. When their eyes met, Bradley felt the air in his chest pull taut. "You writing the love letter?" Patton said, nodding at Bradley's phone where the donor's message lay like a splinter. "No," Bradley said. "Drafting language." "Same difference," Patton said lightly. "Words are foundations too." Patton's flippancy acted like salt on a thin bruise. Bradley's temper, rare and precise, flared. "This is not about your slogans." "Nothing with you ever is," Patton answered. And then, softer, "Not even when it's supposed to be." The exchange should have ended there. Protocol, the project, the looming risk of scandal should have leveled the moment into professional civility. Instead, Bradley surprised himself by asking the question he was supposed to keep behind a secure door. "Have you ever been punished for a relationship?" The question was practical, the way he had learned to translate life into liability. Patton's faltered. He swept a hand through hair that had a wild tendency to escape the bandana. "Once," he said, "in grad school. The head of the department, his partner had influence. When people found out, the partner cut funding to the studio. Jobs evaporated like heat. We thought secrecy would save us. It didn't. It burned both of us." He laughed then, but without humor. "You learn to hide or to lose." The memory slammed into Bradley like a gust against a scaffold. He had kept one eye always on headlines, on what a career could swallow and what it cost to be soft and public. The tale Patton told was about collateral, about how love became a vector for punishment. He understood with painful clarity why Patton was reckless now,
because the world had once hurt him for being known. That made the landscape architect's immediate hunger for honesty both braver and more fragile. That's why I drew the line, Bradley confessed, because the admission tasted less like surrender and more like weight lifted, because I watched people get punished and I didn't want to be next. Patton's face softened, the way a plant leans toward rain. And do you think the line will save you? It kept me employed, Bradley said. It kept me safe. Patton moved closer as if to examine a plant's root system. But it has a different effect on other people, he said. It makes them second guess, makes them mute parts of themselves. The line might keep your career. It will also keep you from being found. Bradley felt exposed in a way paper could not render. Everyone at the site had known him as the man of order, Marisol a keeper of his secrets, the contractors respectful in a wary way. Patton's presence cued a hunger Bradley had not acknowledged, to be seen without the scaffolding of professional armor. I'm not sure what being found would mean for me, he said, which was not untrue. The truth, his private diagnosis, was a sealed edge he had placed in a safe, because sensitivity in his role could be a kind of incompetence in another's eyes. Being found, in that sense, might cost him commissions, vote donors to walk away, and perhaps worse, convince him that he was unfit to carry the city's trust. He had built a life on being competent. Vulnerability felt like incompetence.
Patton's gaze was steady. Maybe it would rearrange your life, he said. Maybe it would make room for things you can't measure in permits. The project became an axis where personal stakes and professional obligations spun against one another. Rumors began to hum like insects, quiet and insistent. Someone saw Bradley and Patton leave a meeting together and made a joke. Someone else overheard laughter and assumed a closeness. Marisol answered emails with practiced calm and forwarded notes to Bradley with a professional dryness that hid the tremor. The more she tried to engineer stability, the more volatile the atmosphere became. The donor's email arrived again, firmer this time, with a decisive line, "We require assurances." Bradley sat with the sentence as if it were a legal instrument and realized the donor's need for clarity was not entirely mercenary. They wanted to avoid scandal. A scandal would scare other donors and could imperil funding for urban projects across the city. Bradley recognized the rationality. He wasn't a villain for protecting the greater good, but he also felt the line of his own life harden. At a site coordination meeting, the issue came to a head. The chair of the donors, Mrs. Easton, the woman with an eyebrow like a barb, asked directly about the implication of the comments she had heard. Her question was thinly veiled as concern for the project's governance. Bradley's pulse moved to a rhythm of ordered steps: acknowledge, reassure, propose third-party oversight. He read from a drafted clause that would require leadership transparency and a ban on romantic relationships between project managers and design staff. The clause used language that felt clinical and permanent. Patton's face did not change, but his voice did. "Do you intend to include the creative team in discussions about these policies?" he asked, suddenly insistent. "Because if we are to build something for the city, we should be part of how it is governed." The donor smiled at the appearance of fairness. Marisol offered a solution that salted both sides: an independent ombudsperson, clear complaint channels, accountability without punitive presumption. It was the kind of compromise Bradley lived by, but as he read the clause out loud, he felt as if every syllable was mortar sealing a room he had not intended to close. After the meeting, the team dispersed with cautious optimism and tightly wound anxieties. Outside, Patton walked with Bradley for a while under scaffolding that threw geometric shadows. For a long time, they said nothing. Finally, Patton stopped and looked at Bradley with an urgency that made the air small. "If you write that clause as is," Patton said, "you will make being human a professional hazard." "You are not the one deciding funding," Bradley said. "You don't understand the pressure from the board." "Maybe," Patton replied, "but I understand how it feels to be pushed into shadow because someone else needs to feel comfortable." Bradley wanted, in that moment, to reach out and close the distance between them with a simpler solution. He imagined walking away from the donors, from the commission, from the safe walls he'd built. He considered leaving his own signature off the clause. He imagined the cost. Contracts rescinded, livelihoods collapsed, his name dragged in a different direction through headlines. He imagined his own vulnerability weaponized. It was a calculus he had learned to perform with ruthless clarity. Yet as he watched Patton's face, open and tremulous, he also saw the cost of his usual choices. A whitewashed life where he remained unhurt but unreachable. "Would you stay if I changed the clause?" he asked, because the truth was not just about policy. It was about what people would risk for him. Patton's answer was quiet. "I would stay if you gave me room to breathe. If you told me you couldn't promise everything. If you let me know you were trying." "And if I couldn't?" Bradley asked. "Then I'd probably leave," Patton said. "But I wouldn't begrudge you the self-protection. I wouldn't make you feel guilty." The conditional tenderness of that statement hit Bradley harder than any threat. He realized that love, if one could call what was stretching between them that, wasn't an all-or-nothing gamble. It was a negotiation in which both parties might be required to forego certain certainties. He had never had the model for that. His father had taught him to measure risk. His mentor had taught him to conceal error. Patton's family had taught the landscape architect to seize delight and survive fallout. Marisol, who had stayed within earshot to monitor the fragile diplomacy, stepped between them with a practical suggestion that carried emotional freight. What if we propose a policy that protects the project, but also includes an element of forgiveness? A clause that allows for disclosed relationships, with conflict of interest management and recusal where appropriate. It would require transparency, but not automatic exile. Bradley considered it, the proposal threading the needle of his two worlds. It still requires us to be honest, he said. Honesty isn't a weakness, Marisol said. It's governance. Honesty. The word felt like a foreign currency. Bradley had hidden his diagnosis because the world did not always pay in kindness. But now honesty had a new dimension. It could be the way to preserve both his integrity and the project he had vowed to see completed. It could make space for imperfect humanness without collapsing into scandal. The negotiations that followed were bureaucratic and intimate in equal measure. Donors grumbled in well-modulated tones. Lawyers suggested language that would satisfy auditors and hearts. Contractors rolled eyes and doubled down on deadlines. Tension mounted like a storm front. In the eye of it, Bradley had to make a choice. Would he be the man who drew lines for certainty, or the man who rearranged them for life? That night, Bradley sat at his desk and drafted an alternative clause. It required disclosure of relationships, mandatory recusal from decisions directly affecting partners, and an independent ombudsperson. But it also incorporated a statement about the project's mission to foster inclusion and human dignity. He wrote with hands that shook not from fear of failing a spreadsheet, but from the admission that his life, too, was part of the project's fabric. He sent the draft to Marisol and Patton with a brief note. For your input, this is my best attempt to protect the work and the people who make it live. Patton's reply came first, immediate and small. This reads like you. I'm proud of you. Marisol's was longer, careful and tender, and unexpectedly raw. It will be difficult, she wrote. There will be people who prefer walls. But if this holds, it could be a model. And there is another thing I have to tell you. Bradley stared at the last line and felt his stomach drop. Marisol, his steady, private ally, had an offer from another firm that could help her family. He had known the outline for weeks. She had kept it close. Her silence had been an act of loyalty. Her confession now was an act of trust. The knowledge rearranged the stakes once again. If the project failed, Marisol might leave. If the clause held and the project survived, she might still take a path of her own choosing. Either way, loyalty was not a currency Bradley could count on indefinitely. He folded the email back into his chest like a leaf pressed between pages. The web of consequences, donor demands, Patton's hurt history, Marisol's family needs, his own fear, grew dense and harder to map. He realized that whatever line he chose to draw would not be neat. It would tug at people who trusted him to be both architect and steward. The pressure to protect and the pressure to love coexisted like two currents pulling at the same structure. Outside, the testbed of wildflowers was an insurgent splash against concrete, fragile and stubborn. Bradley walked to it and crouched, feeling the texture of petals under his fingertips. Patton joined him, and for a long time they worked in companionable silence, two people shaping something that would live beyond them. It was a small intimacy. They were inked with soil, their clothes bearing the day's work. Patton brushed soil from Bradley's knuckles with a thumb that left a trace. "Whatever you choose," he said, "I hope you choose it because it's what you want, not because it's what fear tells you to preserve." Bradley closed his eyes and made the hardest calculation he had ever been asked to make. Choose the safer path and preserve the structure he'd built, or risk reputation and revenue for a chance of being seen, flawed, and whole. The line he had drawn to keep others out had become, in the most terrible and exquisite way, a line he had to decide whether to cross. The next morning, the sun came up on the riverfront as if nothing had happened, but the city glared in sharper colors. A billboard showing a morning news anchor in a suit, a coffee cup steaming, the sense that ordinary light could amplify everything. Bradley found his inbox full of forwarded notes and careful questions. Someone had attached a photograph they said was taken last night,
Bradley and Patton close together under the temporary lights, blurred by motion and intimacy, Patton's hand at Bradley's back. The caption read, "Too cozy for comfort." The photograph moved through inboxes with the velocity of rumor. It landed on the donor's desk, was scanned by the board, forwarded to the firm's PR. Within hours, the narrative bent. An image should have been a neutral document of people at work. Instead, it became the kind of proof that bent donors' stomachs and tightened their checkbooks. It was not scandal if nothing untoward had occurred, except that the implication had weight in the same way a rumor does. Plausibility wore the badge of truth. Bradley felt the photograph as a physical thing. He had known in an abstract way that there were cameras enough and eyes enough to catch him in a moment of foolish grace. He had not thought about what it would do to people who had allied their livelihoods to the project. His immediate inclination was containment. Call the photographer, issue a statement about team cohesion, reassure that no conflicts of interest informed decisions. That was what he had always done: measure, respond, correct. But containment felt like a bandage on an open wound. The donors asked for a meeting that afternoon. Mrs. Easton's tone implied more than a question. She wanted action. "We can't have optics," she said when the team filed into the mahogany boardroom with its view of the river. "Not when we're asking people to invest in our vision." Bradley opened his mouth and spoke with the disciplined cadence that had gotten him this far. He explained the draft he had written, disclosure, recusal, and ombudsperson, and presented it as a way forward. He watched the donors listen, watched their eyes rate the cost-benefit with the calm of people who had never had to choose between love and practicality. Their calculation did not include tenderness. Their calculation included return on investment and reputational risk. Someone on the board asked, casually vicious, whether this inclusive policy would allow for favoritism. The insinuation stung. Bradley answered with technicalities, firewalls, independent oversight, recusal processes, because he still believed systems could make right what hearts complicated.
But as he spoke, he could see Patton's face in the corner of his mind, patient and raw, and feel the distance between the mechanical with which he comforted the board and a living with which he loved boys and cities. Outside the boardroom, whispers proliferated. Someone had reached a reporter. A headline suggestion floated on a private list: Public Project, Private Affairs. The firm's PR counsel urged caution. The donors murmured they needed certainty. The leak was not merely a photograph, but a force that rearranged the space around them. At noon, Marisol called Bradley into the temporary office with a curt message: "We need to talk." Her hands were steady, her voice was not. She closed the door and sat across from him, the lamplight slicing the plan set stacked between them. For a moment, she simply looked at him, and Bradley read the particular way her eyes have learned to ask forgiveness before she spoke. "I got an offer," she said, "from Halverson and Reed. It's good money, better than what we can promise here." It should have been a quiet confession. Instead, it felt in the current atmosphere like an indictment. The timing, after the photograph, while donors fretted, made it feel like a betrayal. Bradley's first feeling was sharp and private, of being abandoned at a crucial hinge. He had known she had options. He had not imagined she would consider leaving, not when their fragile policy threats still needed her deftness to stitch. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. The words had a legal tone he did not intend. "I told you the other day," Marisol said. "I tried to. I told you I had an offer I couldn't ignore if things looked unstable. I didn't want you to feel—" She stopped with a small, ruthless honesty. "I didn't want you to feel forced into a disclosure you weren't ready for." Bradley heard the truth like an accusation. She had been protecting him by hiding the possibility of her exit. "So you plan to leave if this collapsed?" "I plan to survive," she said. "My mother needs a quieter home. There are medical bills that don't wait for urban design glory." The practicality of her answer calmed and scorched at once. He had always admired her ability to keep the firm's day-to-day from collapsing. Now he resented that very pragmatism. Her choice was not drama, it was survival, and within the project's ecosystem, survival sometimes making decisions that felt like betrayals to those still anchored in ideals. "I should have known," Bradley said, not adding that he had thought to keep her in his orbit by keeping things under wraps, by maintaining a boundary that would not require her to pick sides. The irony paralyzed him. His desire to protect his project had required him to shield his collaborators from truth, thereby tethering their fate to his illusions. Marisol reached across the table and laid a hand over his. It was a small, intimate gesture that used to mean comfort. "I love this project," she said.
I love the work and the idea of it feeding people, but I also love my mother, and this offer will do more than words on a paper. If things go sideways and funding pulls, I can't risk her health. Bradley looked at her and realized loyalty asked different things of different people. For Marisol, it demanded stability. For him, it demanded reputation. If he kept the donor satisfied at the cost of everyone else's truth, he would have a project, but not necessarily a team. If he chose openness without a safety net, he risked sacrificing the very project that housed their ambitions. He had not had to choose like this before. At the edge, his heart felt exposed, his chest a ledger open to corroding weather. Marisol left the office heavier than she had entered, and Bradley sat in the hush she left behind, listening to the building settle and the city keep moving. He had not yet made a decision when the PR director came through like a small storm, face taut. "They're on the phone," she said. "The reporter wants comment. The board wants sweeping assurance that there will be zero impropriety." Bradley went through motions, crafted phrases, balanced candor with reassurance, but the strain of the whole machine was starting to show. In the practice of engineering language, he found himself thinning his own words until they were inadequate to the truth. He could see the donors leaning toward safety, a clause that banned relationships outright, the neat defensive solution that would make headlines purr with placidity. He could imagine the donors signing on and seeing the problem contained. In that image, his life was secure but raw. Across the site, Patton received a message that made him stop mid-sentence, a forwarded note from one of the board members, suggesting that the newly proposed inclusive clause was a compromise, but added a private remark about preferable prudence. The line was a polite wink toward stronger measures. In a movement that was impulsive and honest, Patton fired back a reply meant for Bradley but misdirected, with anger and hurt, and an assumption that would widen the fracture. He questioned whether Bradley had always intended to be inclusive, or whether he had only been putting on the language of forgiveness to placate donors. The misaddressed message landed in Bradley's inbox while he was drafting legal recourse for the photograph. He opened it with a sense of déjà vu, the rawness of that old wound Patton had shown him, the story of a department chair who had weaponized power. Patton's message read like an accusation. "Where do your loyalties lie? With the city or with the people who make it beautiful?" Bradley felt something fracture in a way words couldn't reassemble. He wrote an answer that was careful but honest, and attempted bridge work, and sent it. He meant to be conciliatory.
He was not prepared for the speed with which the exchange would be reposted. A contractor had screenshots, a junior architect forwarded them to gossip channels, and within an hour, Patton's abrupt, wounded reply and Bradley's careful response were another layer of the rumor. People on the site read them like a playbook for what anger looks like, and whispers formed like condensations on cold morning glass. Patton, seeing his private grievance turned public, pulled back. He began to avoid meetings that required proximity. He double-booked site visits elsewhere, offering a professional reason for late arrivals. When he did show, the energy between him and Bradley had shifted from combustible to brittle. Their conversations lengthened with apologies and then stopped, leaving the job of reconciliation to a series of increasingly formal emails. Marisol, watching the two men she loved in different ways fold away, felt like a translator whose language had been abolished. She had kept her own secret, an offer that could mean escape, close to her chest, and now watched the very thing that gave her life meaning be eaten by suspicion. Privately, she called the head of Halverson and Reed and deferred with a promise to answer in 2 days. Publicly, she fielded donors' questions with her usual composure, but inside she was unraveling. The project's fragile equilibrium cracked that week. The donors tightened their demands. The board asked for a formal vote on the policy at an emergency hearing. The PR team suggested a line that separated professional relationships from personal ones with a kind of antiseptic cruelty. Engineers complained about delays caused by emotional disruptions. The media's sense of gleeful possibility grew like mold on damp wood. On a Friday afternoon, after a meeting that left everyone drained of optimism, Patton left his tools on a table and walked off the site without saying goodbye. Bradley found his bench empty, the testbed of wildflowers a riot of color that mocked the grayness of the office. He tried to call Patton, voicemail. He texted, a single sentence, "We need to talk." No reply. The silence became its own accusation. People assumed things. Patton's retreat was read as wounded pride. Bradley's visible agitation interpreted as cowardice. Marisol's phone buzzed with recruitment calls. The project became a rumorscape where every intention was reinterpreted as motive. On a Friday afternoon, after a meeting that left everyone drained of optimism, Patton left his tools on a table and walked off the site without saying goodbye. Bradley found his bench empty, the testbed of wildflowers a riot of color that mocked the grayness of the office. He tried to call Patton, voicemail. He texted, a single sentence, "We need to talk." No reply. The silence became its own accusation. People assumed things. Patton's retreat was read as wounded pride. Bradley's visible agitation interpreted as cowardice. Marisol's phone buzzed with recruitment calls. The project became a rumorscape where every intention was reinterpreted as motive. On a Friday afternoon, after a meeting that left everyone drained of optimism, Patton left his tools on a table and walked off the site without saying goodbye. Bradley found his bench empty, the testbed of wildflowers a riot of color that mocked the grayness of the office. He tried to call Patton, voicemail. He texted, a single sentence, "We need to talk." No reply. The silence became its own accusation.
People assumed things. Patton's retreat was read as wounded pride. Bradley's visible agitation interpreted as cowardice. Marisol's phone buzzed with recruitment calls. The project became a rumorscape where every intention was reinterpreted as motive. On a Friday afternoon, after a meeting that left everyone drained of optimism, Patton left his tools on a table and walked off the site without saying goodbye. Bradley found his bench empty, the test bed of wildflowers a riot of color that mocked the grayness of the office. He tried to call Patton. Voicemail. He texted, a single sentence. "We need to talk." No reply. The silence became its own accusation. People assumed things. Patton's retreat was read as wounded pride. Bradley's visible agitation interpreted as cowardice. Marisol's phone buzzed with
The secret that had kept him from being seen had in the end not protected him from being exposed. If anything, it had made his exposure worse. When vulnerability was hidden, it gathered power to blackmail. When it was revealed, it humbled or liberated, depending on who received it. He thought of leaving the clause as it had been drafted, sterile, effective, and building a safe project with controlled human variables. He thought of adopting Marisol's plan for recusal and transparency, and risking donors' ire for the sake of truth. He thought, with a little addictiveness, of simply walking away from the board and their money, and building something smaller, humane, imperfect. As the city's lights blinked awake, he realized that decisions do not arrive as singular moments, but as a series of small betrayals and mercies. The fracturing was no longer hypothetical. It had begun, and people would be hurt depending on which shards he chose to keep in his palm. Bradley stood and walked away from the test bed. He had to do more than the calculus of policy. He had to face the people he had tried to protect by obfuscation. He had to tell Marisol the truth about how much he needed her, and, perhaps more terrifying, the truth about himself. He had to find Patton and explain the difference between caution and concealment, between what the board demanded and what his heart felt. The project was a machine with many cogs, but it was the lives threaded through it, Marisol's obligations, Patton's old wounds, his own secret, that would determine whether the work survived. At the edge of the site, under a temporary chain-link fence, someone had scrawled with a marker, "What we build lives longer than what we fear." Bradley read it and felt the sentence like a dare. He had drawn a line once. Now he faced the mess of consequences when a line is crossed. Somewhere between public skepticism and private cost, one of the most dangerous things could happen. The people he loved could stop trusting him. He had thought his worst fear was losing public trust. Now he understood the other fear with equal clarity, losing the trust of the people who had chosen to stand beside him when the scaffolding was up. The photograph, the offers, the misdirected message, each was its own fracture, and together they had the shape of an ending if he couldn't find a way to make them a beginning. He took a breath that tasted like river and dirt and the cold of the approaching night, and walked toward the office, toward Marisol's chair, and toward the uncertain, destabilizing possibility of explanation. Bradley found Marisol in the quiet of the temporary office, her shoulders rounded against the lamplight, phone face down like a sleeping animal on the plans. He closed the door with more ceremony than the room deserved, and sat across from her, hands unclasped in a way that felt like an admission. "I haven't been honest with you," he said before he could measure it into something palatable. Her eyes, those patient, careful eyes, sharpened in that way that meant she was simultaneously bracing and expectant. Then, don't. Say it. He took the thing out like a small, brittle object, the truth about his diagnosis, the sealed folder he'd kept as proof of his own fragility. He laid it on the table, because words had failed him in the quiet, and the paper looked absurdly vulnerable next to the invariance of contracts and renderings. The words tumbled out in a series of practical confessions, what it meant for his energy, why he'd feared disclosure, and every sentence unknotted a ribbon of tension that had been running through the team like a hidden wire. Marisol didn't flinch. She read, then closed the folder as if closing a window that had let in fresh air. "You think that will scare them?" she asked, not about donors, but about the people who had come to rely on him. "It might," Bradley admitted. "It could cost me votes on the board. It could cost the project money. But it would cost me less than carrying it alone while people I care about are asked to make choices they shouldn't have to make." Marisol laid her hand on his. The movement was part benediction, part bargain. "Thank you for telling me. Now tell them." Bradley wanted to balk, permission to cave to old instincts, but Marisol's steady pressure turned resolve into necessity. They drafted a statement together, frank, procedural, compassionate.
It named the condition without sentimentality and tied his honesty to the governance they had argued for: transparency, recusal, accountability. He would not hide. He would not weaponize his vulnerability. He would make it part of the project's architecture. Then came the harder part: find Patton. He found him at dusk on a different site, hands in the earth of a community garden he'd volunteered for, an impulsive thing Patton did when he needed the world to make sense. Patton started at the side of Bradley, then closed his trowel and stood, soil smeared on his knuckles like a defiant metal. "I read your message," Patton said without preamble. "You told them." "I told Marisol," Bradley corrected. "I plan to tell the board. I can't keep moving like this. I can't keep hiding. Not when people are getting hurt." Patton's face held a storm: relief, anger, hope, every emotion at once. "You could have told me." "I was afraid," Bradley said plainly. "Afraid you'd lose what you had. Afraid you'd be punished again. Afraid I'd lose everything I've built. But I realized something worse. My fear was making choices for you and Marisol without asking." Patton stepped closer, the way someone approaches a plant after a frost to check for life. "What are you willing to risk?" he asked. "For the project? For me?" Bradley thought of contracts and donors and the ledger of a life built on caution. He thought of the way Patton's laughter had rearranged his chest and how Marisol had kept the seam of the team intact. "I'm willing to risk my reputation," he said. "I'm willing to risk being judged. I'm willing to step down from leadership if it protects the work and the people. But I'm not willing to let the image of us destroy the project. Not while there's a way to do both." Patton's lips parted on a laugh that was almost a sob. "That's the scariest thing you've said," he said. They rode into the emergency board meeting together, Bradley in a stiff suit that suddenly felt like ceremonial armor, Patton in work boots that had seen too many tiresome boardrooms. Marisol sat at Bradley's elbow, the anchor he had never called himself but had always needed. The donors were waiting with expectant brows. Reporters lingered like nervous birds. Bradley spoke first. He used the statement they drafted, not a plea, but an articulation of values. He named his condition, explained recusal procedures, and offered a new funding mechanism, a public-private partnership that distributed governance across an independent trust. It would draw on philanthropic pools uninterested in optics and create a buffer so that the project mission could continue regardless of headlines. "And if you can't agree?" Mrs. Easton asked, the barb in her eyebrow lovely in its precision. "Then I will step aside," Bradley said. The declaration landed like a gavel. He could feel Patton and Marisol watching, felt the space between them fill with possibility and terror. "But I won't let fear write the rules for us. This city deserves an honest plan, and the people who make it possible deserve the dignity of truth." There was a tight silence. Fingers tapped on porcelain cups. The board consulted their advisors. The city planner asked clarifying questions. It should have been arithmetic, but it was not. It was ethics stitched into contract language. Patton rose then, impromptu and raw. He could have left them to their votes. Instead, he spoke of the wildflower testbed, of the way color had leaked into concrete and made people slow down. He spoke about what it had been like to hide and what it meant to take a risk on someone who was learning to be honest. Bradley didn't draw a line to be cruel, he said. He drew it because he was afraid. But he is trying to unlearn that. Give him the chance. Give this project the chance to be more than polished surfaces. Marisol's intervention was quieter and steelier. She read a prepared endorsement of the recusal process and the independent ombudsperson's role, and, surprising everyone, she announced she would stay to shepherd the transition if the board agreed to the trust's framework. She would defer Halverson and Reed's offer for now. The board's surprise was visible. Bradley's gratitude was private and immense. The vote that followed felt like bargaining with an uncertain God. There were conditions: external audits, quarterly reporting, an independent trust with donor representation that could not micromanage daily creative decisions. It was not the unconditional embrace Bradley had secretly wanted. It was compromise, cautious, bureaucratic, human. When the vote passed, the sound in the room was small, but it was something like relief. Reporters scribbled and smiled for the cameras. Mrs. Easton offered a measured nod that implied she had not lost everything she required: control. Bradley stepped out into the cold air with Patton at his side and Marisol on the other, and for the first time in weeks, the three of them moved forward without the shadow of withheld truth between them. Outside, as city lights blinked awake, Patton reached for Bradley's hand. The contact was simple and brave and small. Bradley accepted,
fingers folding around soil-warmed skin. "You could have asked me to leave," Patton said softly. "I nearly did," Bradley admitted, "but I've learned that the braver act is not to draw lines, but to own the crossing." Patton leaned in and kissed him then, not in secrecy, but in the open air where the river could be a witness. It was a kiss that tasted of sacrifice and celebration, of a man who had risked reputation and a man who had risked being hurt. Marisol watched them with tears she did not hide, a smile that was part sorrow and part triumph. The project would still require work, contracts to rewrite, trust to be built, patience to be offered in measured doses. There would be donors who withdrew. There would be painful articles and awkward town hall meetings. But there was now a governance that let people be fallible, and a trio who had decided, aloud and together, that the city they wanted to build was one where people could be seen. That night, Bradley walked the test bed with Patton and Marisol on either side. They crouched among the wildflowers, hands busy with soil and roots, and planted a small new road together, a deliberate, humble pledge to tend something that might outlast all of them. When the first seed met the earth, Bradley felt, for the first time in a long while, that the mess he had feared could be the very thing that made a living place. He had drawn a line once, now he had crossed it, and in crossing found a claim he could finally stake, that love and duty need not be enemies, and that sometimes the cost of truth is the price of everything worth keeping. They planted the last handful of seeds with small, ceremonial slowness, a private liturgy after the day's sharp votes and softer compromises. Marisol dug the shallow trench with the practicality that had steadied them through leaks and headlines. Patton scattered the seed in a reckless, generous arc. Bradley tamped the soil with patient fingers, as if he could make certainty grow by force of touch. When the dirt closed over the tiny promise, each of them felt the same fragile lightness. Something had been set in motion that might take root.
The board trimmed conditions and tempered language until the policy felt like a garment tailored for an awkward but honest body, protective without being punitive. A handful of donors withdrew, the kind Bradley had always assumed would. Their money found other, less complicated causes. Others stayed, convinced by the architecture of checks and the moral courage they'd seen. Halverson and Reed waited politely. Marisol kept her name off their roster, choosing instead to remain and help hold the project steady. She did it not from heroism, but from a ledger of obligations and a newfound belief that the work could be done without erosion of self. Bradley promised to make space for her needs, flexible hours, a stipend to manage her mother's care, and she promised, with a smile that was all economy and warmth, to keep tending the plans and the people who executed them. Patton and Bradley moved forward in public as they had in private, awkward, honest, clumsy with disclosures, and generous with repair. They learned how to apologize without turning it into policy, how to hold one another when sleepless nights came, and how to step back when the work demanded distance. The ombudsperson's first report praised the trust's governance and the team's transparency. It also noted the wobbles of human beings learning new rules of engagement. It read like a good thing, an admission that systems can hold tenderness if people are willing to name it. There were small pains afterward, a town hall whose questions cut too close to home, a columnist who searched for scandal and instead found stubborn, ordinary courage. But there were also afternoons when children chased one another through the newly softened plaza, elders read on benches that were intentionally imperfect, and cyclists slowed because someone had planted unexpected color at the edge of the path. The city noticed that something gentler could also be durable. One evening, months after the photograph that started the storm, the three of them returned to that test bed, their hands fuller with calluses and fewer with fear. The wildflowers had multiplied in a way that felt miraculous, a hillside of small insurgent color reclaiming a corner of the riverfront. They sat on the bench Bradley had once measured to the millimeter and let the noise of the city be a kind of applause. Patton leaned his head on Bradley's shoulder. Bradley rested his cheek against Patton's hair and let himself be held without the careful scaffolding of rules. Marisol wrapped an arm around both of them, a triangle of impossible repair and chosen family. They watched the river move, patient and indifferent and inexorable, smoothing stories into sediment. "What you build," Marisol said softly, "outlives the fear you had of building it." Bradley opened his mouth, and for once the words were simple and entire. "We built it together." They sat until the light thinned to a final gilded hush, the city breathing, the bench steady beneath them, and the wildflowers trembling like small flags. In that quiet, the line Bradley had once drawn became something else, not a wall to protect him, but a border crossed and remade into a threshold. They had risked reputation and comfort, and in the crossing had found an answer less tidy than the plans, but truer in its ruins and its bloom. The river moved on, and so did they. Rooted in the same place, changed by the crossing, keeping an eye on the fragile, beautiful thing they'd chosen to tend.